Good afternoon, everybody. It's Tuesday the 18th of March 2025, and back by popular request is Rev Jim Rea. Jim, you've got something to tell us this afternoon.
Well, as this is the month of March, and in a few months we will be thinking about and commemorating the end of World War II, at least war in Europe. And I have some stories about war heroes of one kind or another. One is from the First World War, and three, in fact, are from World War II. So let me tell you about Sybil. Now, Sybil McGackie was a remarkable woman. In fact, she was a great member of the East Befast Mission with her husband George. Sybil was from Tinnahealy in County Wicklow, and she came to be a deaconess in the Grosvenor Hall, which is now known as the Belfast Central Mission. She lived in Earlswood Road, and many a day I would visit her, and she was an inspiration, over 90, remarkable memory. And one day in her home, she told me a story about her brother George. George was recruited into the British Army while living in Tinnahealy into the First World War. And he was a remarkable man. And Sybil told me that George was loved by all the family, and she still remembers, as a wee girl playing in the corner, George coming over to her, praying with her, giving her a kiss, and she'd never see him again. He went into the First World War and fought in the trenches. He was a sergeant, actually, and something happened was that he was a very devout Christian, and he always carried a New Testament in the breast pocket of his uniform. So one day, just as they were about to go over the top, as they say, George stood up in the trench and he read scripture to the men who were in the trench with him. He was a sergeant. He went over the top and he would never ever be seen again. And one day the family in Tinnahealy got a simple piece of correspondence, telegram, missing, presumed dead. No grave has ever been found for George Thompson, as he was known. However, something happened. Several years passed, and one day a man called at the house in Tinnahealy. He said he was called Bertie. They brought him in. He said that he was the last man to see George, the brother, and he said that what had happened was that he recalled George standing up in the trench, reading scripture to the troops and telling them that one thing he was assured of was that whatever would happen to him, he would know that he would go to be with his Lord. And he gave those men that assurance. Now, what Bertie went on to say was that had such a powerful impression on him that he later committed his life to Christ and became a Christian. And so he came to tell the family. But he wasn't living in Ireland. He had made that journey particularly. He was working in England, and he was now, believe it or not, an evangelist, travelling all over England, preaching the gospel. He came from the same part as the world. He was an Irishman, came from Ireland. But I often think about that story, and in these years when we revisit World War II and also the First World War, I'm ever thankful for Sybil. What a wonderful woman who told me that remarkable story about her brother. As for Sybil, George and Bertie, they have now won their final victory that the grave can no longer defeat. What an inspiring story that I will never forget. It was a summer day in the apple country, which we call County Armagh, and I was sitting talking to my friend Stephen Armstrong when he told me a remarkable story about his father. His father went to fight in World War I, and he signed up with the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. But very early in the war, he was captured by the Germans, and he was taken to a prisoner of war camp in Poland. What happened was that prisoners would be taken out during the daytime to farms, and there they would have to work. And then at night, the German Nazi soldiers would come back, round them up, and put them back into the prisoner of war camp. So one day, he was sitting here in this farm, and something happened. He heard distress, maybe sadness, crying. He knew something was wrong. And so he did what he should not have done, because to do so would have meant that he would be basically shot by the Germans if he had any relationship with the farmers. But knowing that something had gone on and realising that a motorcyclist had come into the farm, he decided to do it, to go down and offer his sympathy to the people in the farm. They were deeply impressed. It was an amazing story. And from that time on, they fed him secretly, and they held him in places where he would be safe. And he was there for all of this time, until one day he heard these noises like explosions. It was 1944, 1945. The war was coming to an end in Europe when a platoon of Russian soldiers entered the farm, and they lined the family up and asked them one by one their name. Now, the family name was Springle. The woman, the mother, was German, the father was Polish, and so were the children. There were 6 of them. And then, at the end of the line, none other than Eric Armstrong. So the officer asked for their names, and they went down the list from father, mother, children, and then to Eric Armstrong. He looked at the Russian officer, and he said, "My name is Eric Armstrong. I am a prisoner of war, serving with the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers." The officer looked for a moment, stared, removed a gun from his holster, handed it to Eric, and said to him, "You shoot them. They are your captors." And he looked at the officer and he said, "There is no way I can do that, because," he said, "these people have been good to me, and I'm not going to do it." He thought that maybe they now would be all killed. But the Russian officer put the revolver back in his holster and walked away. Sometime later, not too long, Eric was released and was able to move on from Poland. But that experience was very, very difficult, because there were very many days of danger as he made his way into the safe hands of the British Army. Interestingly, when Eric actually went to the farm, he would pray, because he was a Christian, and he would pray, and he used to pray to the Lord, "Lord, why am I here?" Believe it or not, up until this very day, the Armstrong family have connections with these friends in Poland. Isn't that an amazing story? And when the war was ended and he was liberated, they become lifelong friends. I've often thought about that. Eric Armstrong asks the question, "Lord, why am I here? Why am I here?" And I think the reason is obvious. As we remember the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II, it will bring back a personal memory from 1975. I, with a group of young people, went to do a youth mission in a German town in West Germany. It was called Heilbronn, a beautiful rebuilt city that had been flattened during the war. My immediate observation was the enthusiasm and the commitment of these German Christians. On the first day, I met a man called Albert. he was a minister of what is known as the Evangelical Methodist Church of Germany, and his name was Albert. He had something about him. He had a shine, white hair, lovely shine to him, lovely personality. But one evening, he was responsible for taking me back to the place where I was staying. And so he stopped the car and we had a conversation. Now, he wasn't completely au fait with English, but in his ability to communicate in broken English, he just told me this story. He said, as a young man, I was a member of Hitler Youth and I was in the Nazi army. He said, I was captured and I was put into a prisoner of war camp. And what I want to say to you is this, that as a German, I want to apologise of how the people of Germany were brainwashed by the dictator Hitler, and all the damage that was done to people, the ruination of their lives caused by this terrible war. He then went on to tell me that he had ended up in a prisoner of war camp, and that one day someone smuggled in a copy of the New Testament. Now, Albert told me that he wasn't a bit familiar with the Bible or the New Testament. In fact, this was a reading of the New Testament for the very first time. So he read about the birth of Christ. He read about his death on the cross. He read about his resurrection. And he read the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of the Apostle Paul, resulting on Albert giving his life to Christ and becoming a minister, pastor of the Evangelical Methodist Church of what was then West Germany. I've often wondered about that story. I've often wondered, who was the smuggler? Did they ever get to know Albert, or did they ever find him? But what it tells me, that God moves in mysterious ways, and a man somewhere or a woman who attempted to get that New Testament into that particular place, that prison camp, had done a wonderful thing, an act of God that had brought a man into the light of the gospel and ended up being a pastor and a preacher of the good news. I'll always remember, way back 50 years ago, the story of meeting Albert the Nazi. It was in the 1980s when I met the famous Scottish Church of Scotland minister, Murdo Macdonald. He had come to Edgehill College to talk to a group of ministers about various things relating to theology. But the most memorable thing was the story he told us about himself. He actually became a chaplain in the British Army, and he was eventually to become a prisoner of war because he had been fighting in North Africa, and he'd been brought to a terrible prison camp on the German-Polish border. He discovered, interestingly, that he actually was to become the prison chaplain to the Americans. So he was separated from the Scotch and British regiments, who were on one side of the fence, and the Americans. So he was there with these American prisoners, a bit of an unfamiliar situation for him. But what happened was, because there was a prisoner in the Scottish camp, a member of the Scottish regiment, he was conveying messages across the fence in Gaelic, because Murdo Macdonald came from Harris, the island of Harris in the Hebrides. And so this went on for quite some time. But the Germans got to know about it, and they put up large speakers in order to drown out any particular things that would be passed across as messages. After 2.5 years living in these conditions, he sought to educate prisoners, he sought to help them with counselling and various other things. He became the real leader of the camp. One morning, an American prisoner came to him and said, "Get yourself ready. There's a Sunday at the fence." And so, when he went out, here was a Scottish-speaking Gaelic speaker on the fence, shouting across in what I think might be 3 words, but I can't pronounce Gaelic. 2 words, and the 2 words were these: "They've come." Liberation was in sight. It was the end, and the future was hopeful. The prisoners were being released. In his book, Murdo Macdonald tells of the desperate days ahead, walking for miles and miles, living in difficult conditions. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his efforts and for all the wonderful things he did. But the most interesting thing is, on that day, when he used these 2 words in Gaelic, "They've come," he related to the gospel. Christ had come, made a difference. Christ had died on the cross, made a difference. Christ had been raised from the dead, made a difference. Christ had become the King of Kings. What a difference. And he said, nothing compared with the story of the gospel that told about the future and the present and the great Christian hope that evil will ultimately defeat it and Christ will reign for all time in eternity. Thanks, Murdo, for your wonderful story.
Thank you, Jim. And maybe we'll get a few more stories on another occasion.